One of the questions that is asked of Jesus initially is, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And that's a question that we see throughout many, many stories. Even towards the end of Ordinary Time, we heard it asked from the rich young man, "What must I do? I've done all these commandments. What must I do?" There's this question internally, not just from a legalistic standpoint, but inwardly of how do I receive this grace? What is eternal life? How do I receive it? Recognizing that from the Lord, the good teacher, the good one, that he has something to say.
Every time the Lord responds, he responds with something that's typically Jewish. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. Or with the rich young man, he said, keep the commandments. And so he's not putting something out there that's new. He's telling them something that they would be fully aware of. But there's a real desire to know what is it that leads to eternal life. Even in the man who's asking in the parable of the Good Samaritan leading up to it, and the rich young man and several others.
What we see as the conversation progresses is Jesus responding to questions with questions, which is a remarkable tactic of mercy made flesh, and responding with questions to questions, which in some sense is looking for another solution, which is ultimately presence. Obviously, the Lord is teasing that out, but the Lord's response to him elicits this reaction of, what must I do? And the Lord asks him, you used to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then to love your neighbor. That's the answer of the man who is speaking with Jesus. And then as he wishes to justify himself from this state of giving his own answers, his own responses, right alongside of this is his question, justifying himself back to the Lord. Who is my neighbor? It's a powerful question.
So the answer that the Lord gives when the man asks, who is my neighbor, is of course to tell a parable. But he could have said, well, your neighbor is this person and it's that person. Because, in the old law, there is a thing where it says you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. That comes from Deuteronomy. However, if somebody is your enemy, it does not say love your enemies. And so when the Lord gives this parable, he's setting up something that's going to be a real, almost a cognitive dissonance to the Jews to see how this all plays out. In a Jewish mind, you would think, I know who the neighbor is, but they don't.
As far as the setting of this parable, the fact that it's in these locations is significant. Jerusalem is the city of peace, and whether one's going towards it or leaving this city of peace, Jerusalem, the city of peace, the Prince of Peace, obviously, the sower who went out to sow, Christ sowing in this man, this conversation. It's significant, these places. So although it's a parable, real places, made up figures that we can easily see. We can see ourselves in different ones at different times. Well, even though Father and I can't see ourselves in priests as they walk by and do nothing, at least we hope we can see ourselves in these characters. But the significance of the setting of the city of peace obviously should flow into our lives, into the way we treat our neighbors.
Well, the Lord doesn't say if he was Jewish, but the implication or the inference is that he was Jewish because he's going to Jerusalem, whereas people who weren't, Jerusalem is the holy city where you have to go 3 times a year. And I don't think that the Samaritans would have made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem because they're northern people, and they have kind of split off, if you will. The first two were a priest and a Levite, which of course is the Levites are the priestly caste. They were very particular to not become ritually unclean. And so seeing somebody in that shape and the possibility that maybe this person's unclean, and the way the Jews looked at things as if I come in contact with something that's unclean, then I become unclean. And then I have to do this and that and the other thing before I can be clean again. in this instance, as a priest, to go in and do whatever it is I'm assigned to do at the temple. And so there would have been this sort of almost habitual reaction against helping somebody because of this desire to be ritually pure.
And like in response to the ritual cleanliness, there are reasons for the law in the Old Testament and at that time. So obviously the medical conditions of people we hear with even leprosy, it's outrageous for us today to think of these people and how could they not be assisted, which in some sense is what the Lord is getting at ultimately. For the sake of the ritual purity, it's not an OCD preoccupation with avoiding something. There's cultural and there's cultural conditions that in some sense our health is safeguarded by some of these avoidances. Again, the Lord is obviously speaking into that, but it's not crazy that people wanted to stay ritually pure, and there's reasons for this ritual purity and the life of the community in that day and age.
That's a wrap.